Hey everyone, welcome back to English Inside Out. Today's episode is going to be very interesting because we're going to talk about something that a lot of English learners experience, but don't always understand clearly.
Yeah. And this is one of those situations where you're technically doing everything right. Your grammar is correct. Your sentence makes sense. The words you're using are not wrong. And still, something feels off.
Exactly, you say something and people understand you, but it doesn't sound natural. It doesn't sound like something a native speaker would actually say.
Yeah. And that can be really frustrating. Because at that point, it's not about learning basic English anymore. It's about that next level, sounding natural.
And I think this is where a lot of learners get stuck. Because they feel like, I'm saying it correctly. So why does it still sound weird?
Exactly. And the problem is, nobody really explains this clearly.
Yeah, because most courses focus on grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, but they don't really focus on how people actually speak.
And that's what we're going to explore today. Not just what is correct, but what sounds natural.
Because those are two different things. And understanding that difference is what takes your English from good to actually sounding natural and comfortable. Let's imagine a simple situation. You're talking to someone and you want to say, I did a party yesterday. Grammatically, it's not completely crazy. People might understand what you mean.
Yeah, but it doesn't sound right.
Exactly, a native speaker would say, I had a party yesterday.
And that difference is not about grammar rules you memorized. It's about usage. It's about what people actually say. And this is something really important to understand. You can be correct and still sound unnatural.
Yeah, and that's not a failure. It's just the next step in your learning. So in this episode, we're going to go through real examples of sentences that are correct, but sound weird.
And we're going to show you how native speakers would actually say them. And more importantly, why. So, by the end of this episode, you'll start noticing these differences and slowly adjusting your own speech.
Yeah, and once you start noticing it, you can't unsee it.
That's true. All right, let's jump into the first example. All right, so let's start with a very common example. And this is something that happens a lot with learners, especially at the intermediate level. Because at this point, you already know a lot of vocabulary. You can build sentences. But sometimes you combine words in a way that feels logical, but not natural.
Yeah, and this is a perfect example of that. Because if you think about it logically, do a party, it kind of makes sense, right? You're organizing something, you're doing something, so your brain connects do with party.
Exactly. It's not random. There's a logic behind it. But English doesn't always follow that kind of logic.
So someone might say, I did a party yesterday.
And here's the interesting part. People will probably understand you. It's not like it's impossible to understand, but it immediately sounds off.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like something a native speaker would say naturally.
The natural version would be, I had a party yesterday. And this is where we get into something really important, which is how certain verbs naturally pair with certain nouns.
Yeah, this is not just vocabulary, it's about combinations.
Exactly. In English, we say, have a party, have a meeting, have dinner.
But we don't say, do a party, do a dinner. And this is something you can't always figure out just by translating. Because in your language, the verb might be completely different.
Yeah. So, instead of translating word by word, you start learning chunks. Let's look at a few more examples that follow the same pattern. We say, have lunch, have a conversation, have a good time.
And imagine if someone said, I did a conversation with him.
Yeah, that sounds very strange.
Exactly correct idea, wrong combination. Let's imagine a quick conversation. What did you do last weekend?
I did a party with my friends.
Yeah, I understand, but it sounds a bit unnatural.
A more natural way would be, I had a party with my friends.
Yeah, and that sounds completely normal.
And this is where a lot of learners get frustrated, because they feel like, I said the right thing, so why is it wrong?
Yeah, but it's not really wrong, it's just not how people usually say it. So instead of trying to guess or build sentences word by word, start paying attention to how words come together.
Yeah. Notice patterns like have a T-word shiras, and you'll start seeing it everywhere. For example, I had a great time. I had a really good day. I had a long conversation with her.
And all of these sound very natural, even though they use the same structure.
All right, so that's a really good starting point.
Yeah. And once you start noticing this, you'll realize this happens a lot in English.
So let's look at another example, because this next one is something almost every learner says at some point.
All right? So this next one is very common. And I think almost every learner says this at some point. Because again, it feels logical.
Yeah, this is one of those cases where your brain is trying to build English in a very reasonable way, but English just doesn't follow that logic.
Exactly. So the sentence is, I made a photo. And again, people will understand you. They'll know what you mean.
Yeah, but it immediately sounds a bit strange. It's not something you would normally hear in a natural conversation. The natural way to say this is, I took a photo.
And this is one of those expressions that you just have to get used to. Because take doesn't really mean pegger here in a literal way.
Yeah, and this is where things get interesting. Because if you translate take a photo literally, it doesn't make much sense.
Exactly. You're not taking the photo from somewhere. You're creating it. In a way,
But English uses take for this action, and that's just how the language works. So again, this is not about grammar. It's about collocation, words that naturally go together.
yeah. And once you start noticing these patterns, you stop trying to translate everything, and you start thinking more in English. Let's look at a few more examples that follow the same idea. We say, take a photo, take a picture, take a selfie.
But we don't say, make a photo, do a picture.
Yeah, that sounds very unnatural.
Let's imagine a situation. You're traveling with a friend, and you want them to take a picture of you. Can you make a photo of me?
Yeah, I understand what you mean, but it sounds a bit off.
A more natural way would be, can you take a photo of me?
Or even more natural. Can you take a picture of me? And this is where things get even more interesting. Because in real conversations, people often simplify even more. Instead of saying, can you take a photo of me? They might say, can you take a picture? Can you get a picture of me?
Yeah, and these small variations make your English sound more flexible, more natural. I think a big mistake here is trying to apply logic too strictly, like thinking, okay, I am creating something, so I should use make.
Yeah, but English doesn't always follow that kind of logic. It follows patterns that come from usage. So the more you focus on how people actually speak, the easier it becomes to choose the right combination.
Yeah, instead of asking, what is the correct verb, you start asking, what do people usually say? Let's add a few more natural examples. I took a photo at the beach. She took a picture of her dog. We took a lot of photos on our trip.
All of these sound completely natural, and they follow the same pattern.
All right, so now we've seen two really common examples.
And hopefully, you're starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah, you can be correct, but still not sound natural.
So let's move to the next one. Because this one is something people say all the time.
All right, this next one is really interesting because it's one of those mistakes that feels completely natural when you say it, and that's exactly why it happens so often. Because if you're thinking in your native language first, and then translating into English, there's a very good chance that your brain is going to choose the word open. And logically, it makes sense, because you're starting something, activating something. So your brain connects that idea with open.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes this kind of mistake tricky. Because it's not random, it's not careless. There's actually a clear logic behind it. You're not guessing, you're trying to apply a system that works in your language. But the problem is that English doesn't always follow that same system. So even though your sentence makes sense in your head, when it comes out, it sounds slightly off to a native speaker. So a learner might say something like, I opened the TV.
And again, just like the other examples, people will probably understand what you mean. They'll know you're talking about turning the TV on. But it doesn't sound natural at all. It's one of those sentences where nothing is wrong in a dramatic way. But it just doesn't match how English is actually used. The natural way to say this is, I turned on the TV.
Yeah. And that's what you'll hear in real conversations all the time. It's not optional. It's just the standard way people express this idea.
And I think this is a really important moment to understand something deeper, because this is not about memorizing one sentence. It's about recognizing a pattern. In English, when we talk about activating or starting electronic devices, we don't use open. We use turn on.
Exactly. And once you understand that pattern, it doesn't apply just to TVs. It applies to a whole group of things. So for example, we say, turn on the TV, turn on the lights, turn on the computer, turn on the air conditioner.
And once you start noticing this, you realize how consistent it actually is. It's not random. It's just a different way of organizing actions in the language. And I think this is where a lot of learners get stuck, because they try to translate actions directly, instead of learning how English groups those actions. So instead of thinking, what is the equivalent of this word? It's often better to think, how do people usually express this idea?
Yeah, exactly. Because language is not just about individual words. It's about patterns that repeat over time. And once you start recognizing those patterns, you don't need to translate anymore. You just know what sounds right. Let's imagine a simple situation at home. You're sitting on the couch and you ask someone, "Can you open the TV?"
And again, I understand what you mean, but it feels slightly unnatural. It's not something I would expect to hear in a casual conversation. A more natural way to say it would be, "Can you turn on the TV?"
Or even more natural, especially in a relaxed tone. "Can you turn the TV on?" And this is another detail that helps your English sound more natural. The flexibility of the sentence. Because in real conversations, people don't always stick to one structure. They move things around a bit.
Yeah, exactly. Turn on the TV and turn the TV on. Both are completely natural, and hearing both versions helps you become more flexible when you speak. A common mistake here is trying to use open for anything that involves starting or activating something. So you get sentences like, open the TV, open the light.
Yeah, open the light sounds really strange.
Exactly. And again, it's not about intelligence or level, it's just about learning how English naturally connects actions and verbs.
So the key idea here is this: don't just learn words, learn how they're used together.
Yeah, because that's what makes your English sound natural, not just correct. Let's look at a few more natural sentences. I turned on the TV and watched a movie. She turned off the lights before going to bed. I forgot to turn on my laptop this morning.
All of these are simple, but they sound exactly like real English. And that's what you want.
All right, so now we've seen a few situations where the sentence makes sense, but doesn't sound natural.
Yeah. And this is something that happens a lot more than people think.
So let's move to the next one, because this one is a bit more subtle, but it shows up all the time in conversations.
All right? So this next example is a bit different from the previous ones. Because now we're not talking about actions like do, make, or turn on. We're talking about how you express something more internal, like uncertainty. And this is where things get really interesting. Because even if your sentence is grammatically structured in a way that feels correct, it can still sound unnatural if it doesn't match how native speakers actually express that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is one of those areas where learners rely heavily on translation, because when you don't know how to express something naturally, your brain goes back to your native language and tries to recreate the same structure in English. And again, there's logic behind it. It's not random, but the result is something that sounds a bit unusual in real conversation. So a learner might say something like, "I'm with doubt." And once again, people will probably understand what you mean. They'll get the idea that you're unsure about something, but it doesn't sound natural at all.
Yeah, it feels like something is slightly off. Not enough to completely break communication, but enough to make the sentence sound different from what a native speaker would say. So instead of saying, "I'm with doubt," you would normally say, "I'm not sure," or "I have doubts."
And both of these are completely natural, but they're used a bit differently depending on the situation. "I'm not sure" is probably the most common one. It's simple, flexible, and works in almost any situation. If you're hesitating, if you're thinking, if you don't have a clear answer, that's usually the go-to expressions.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so powerful. Because in real conversations, people don't always give strong, confident answers. A lot of the time, they're unsure, they're thinking, they're processing, and I'm not sure fits perfectly into those moments. So, for example, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. I'm not sure what he meant. I'm not sure if I have time tomorrow.
And all of these sound very natural, very conversational, and very easy to use in real time. Now, I have doubts is a bit different. It's a little stronger, a little more specific. You're not just unsure, you're actually questioning something.
Yet there's a bit more weight to it, like you're not convinced. You're leaning more toward, this might not be right. So let's compare. I'm not sure this will work. Yes, I have doubts that this will work.
The first one feels more neutral. The second one feels more skeptical. And this is where things go beyond just correct versus incorrect. Now we're talking about nuance, about how your choice of words changes the feeling of the sentence.
Exactly. And this is what makes your English sound more natural. Not just using the right structure, but choosing the expression that fits the situation. Let's imagine a conversation. Do you think this plan is going to work?
I'm with doubt about this.
Yeah, I understand what you mean, but it sounds a bit unnatural.
A more natural way would be, I'm not sure about this, or I have some doubts about this.
And both of those sound completely natural, just slightly different in tone. And I think this example shows something really important. As your English improves, the challenge is not just saying things correctly, it's expressing yourself in a way that feels natural, flexible, and real.
Yeah, and that often means letting go of direct translation and starting to trust how the language is actually used. Let's look at a few more natural examples. I'm not sure what to do next. I'm not sure if she's coming. I have doubts about that decision.
All of these are simple, but they sound exactly like real conversations.
All right, so now we've looked at a few different examples.
And hopefully you're starting to notice a pattern here.
Yeah, it's not just about being correct. It's about sounding natural.
So let's move into the final part and bring everything together.
So, if we take a step back and look at everything we talked about today, there's a very clear pattern here. In all of these examples, the sentences were not completely wrong. They made sense. They communicated something. But they didn't sound like something a native speaker would naturally say.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to sit with for a moment, because a lot of learners think in a very black and white way, like something is either correct or incorrect. But in reality, there's this whole middle area where something is technically understandable, but still doesn't feel natural. And that's exactly where a lot of intermediate learners are. They're not beginners anymore. They can communicate. They can build sentences. But something still feels a little off when they speak.
Yeah, and that off feeling is not about grammar anymore. It's about usage. It's about patterns. It's about how words naturally come together in real conversations. If we go back to the examples we saw, do a party, have a party, make a photo, take a photo, open the TV, turn on the TV, I'm with doubt, I'm not sure, in every case. The idea was clear, but the expression needed a small adjustment to sound natural.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that these are not big changes. They're small, but they make a huge difference in how your English is perceived, and I think this is the key shift. Stop focusing only on being correct, and start paying attention to what sounds natural.
Yeah, because natural English is not built word by word. It's built in chunks, in patterns, in combinations that people use again and again. So if you're wondering, okay, how do I actually improve this? There's a very simple starting point. Instead of asking yourself, is this correct? Start asking, have I heard this before?
Yeah, that question changes everything. Because if you've heard it many times, there's a good chance it's natural.
And if it sounds like something you've never really heard, it might be correct, but not common.
So imagine you're about to say something, and you hesitate for a second. Instead of trying to build the perfect sentence, try to remember how people usually say that idea. Like instead of thinking, how do I say this perfectly? Think, what would I normally hear in a conversation?
Yeah, and even if your sentence is simpler, even if it's not perfect, it will probably sound more natural.
And I think this also takes a lot of pressure off because now you're not trying to invent English in real time. You're reusing patterns that already exist.
Yeah, and that makes speaking feel much lighter, more fluid, less stressful.
So here's something simple you can start doing today. When you watch videos, listen to podcasts, or talk to people, pay attention to how sentences are actually formed. Not just the meaning, but the combinations.
Yeah. Notice things like which verbs go together, which expressions repeat how people simplify what they say. Because at the end of the day, natural English is not about knowing more words. It's about using them the way people actually do. All right, I think that's a good place to stop.
This was a really important one.
And honestly, if you start paying attention to this, you'll notice improvement pretty quickly.
Exactly. So don't just listen, start noticing, and start using.
And we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye, guys.